Welcome to China Considered, a podcast that brings fresh insights and informed discussion to one of the most consequential issues of our time, how China is changing and changing the world. I'm Liz Economy, Hargrove Senior Fellow and co-director of the U.S., China, and the World program at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Today, I have with me Dr. Adam Segal. He's a China expert who also directs the Digital and Cyberspace Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. He served in the Biden administration State Department, where he authored the administration's international cyber strategy, and he's a world-renowned expert on both China and digital policy. It's great to have you with us today, Adam.
Thanks for having me on, Liz.
So let's start with what's going on right now with DeepSeek. It's captured everybody's attention, caused the U.S. stock market, NVIDIA stock, to plummet. Explain to us why DeepSeek is so important. Do we need to be as worried as everybody seems to be? What is this all about?
Yeah, DeepSeek's breakthrough poses kind of three big questions about how we're approaching AI in China. So the model itself seems to have been trained on much fewer chips than somebody like OpenAI has used, so much less resource intense. And we saw with, last week with President Trump announcing the initiative on Stargate, the U.S. is basically assuming that this was going to be massive. Our AI future is going to be both massively chip and energy dependent. So DeepSeek seems to question that. Second, they're an open source model, so not proprietary. Llama is Meta's open source model, but again, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, and others have used a different model. And once a model has been developed, it can diffuse very quickly. And so the question is about what kind of controls the U.S. can keep on that. And then finally, the U.S. has been hoping to slow China down. And, until 3 weeks ago, everybody would have told you the U.S. was far ahead in AI. And we were hoping to slow China down by control over chips through NVIDIA and others. So the fact that this breakthrough still happened has made many people question whether those controls are actually useful or not.
So, you've worked in this space for a very long time. Few people know China and technology as well as you do. Are you surprised by this? Do you think we should be surprised? What's your sort of assessment?
Yeah, I think I think people are surprised on the technical and scientific breakthrough. I think, we shouldn't take anything away from that. I am not a artificial intelligence scientist, but reading other people, they are definitely impressed in what they've accomplished. I don't think we should be surprised in the sense that we know that, China has also identified AI as being critical to their national economic and political security, and they're going to do everything they can to make sure that they are competitive. And we shouldn't be surprised that China seems to have found ways to work around it.
In sort of my mind, AI was one of China's Made in China 2025 technologies, right? That they established as a priority back in 2014, sort of a 10-year, 2015 to 2025 timeframe for them to become like domestic champions and then global champions. And we've seen what they've been able to do in a whole host of technologies, right? In particular, new energy vehicles, right? The EVs, clean tech. To my mind, this is just yet another one of those technology areas where China is going to demonstrate its prowess. It's been investing for a long time, and as you said, it's a priority. I guess the question is, what should we do about it, if anything? Does this signal like the need for a change in U.S. policy, do you think?
So I think the arguments about export controls not working are premature, right? It takes a while for hardware controls to have an impact. There were loopholes that the Biden administration closed at the end there, so those will have an effect. And we probably shouldn't take this narrow breakthrough for one system to stand in for the entire ecosystem. So the chips themselves are incredibly important for diffusion and how other companies use it, and that clearly is going to have an effect. And the Chinese themselves, I mean, the founder of DeepSeek keeps on saying, our biggest burden is access to chips. So they're clearly having a bite. So I don't think that that's going to cause them, that's probably premature, a major rethink on there. I think the big question um, that is still open, and we just don't know how the Trump administration is going to respond, is in the last week, the Biden administration issued an executive order on AI diffusion, which has to do about, how many chips can be sent to certain countries and what the hyperscalers, the cloud companies, where they can build their data centers. And, we didn't really know how the Trump administration was going to respond to that. They, have typically said that they think regulations on AI have slowed the US down. So I think we'll have to wait and see how they think about that.
So it seems like just in the past few weeks, both with the sort of development or the sort of, the whole arrival of DeepSeek and then the change in administration here, there's gonna be a lot of uncertainty about where this AI race, so to speak, is gonna go.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Trump administration has been very clear, in their first executive order on AI, which came out last week as well, that a lot of the talk about that was very prominent in the Biden administration about trust and safety and regulation. And the Trump administration is thinking a lot about investment in infrastructure, talking a lot about energy and how they're going to supply the energy for their but, as I said before, the regulation they see is slowing it down. So that direction, I think, is pretty clear. The questions about export controls, I think we're going to still see a debate inside the administration and where they come out on.
Right. Great. So let's now turn to what I really want to talk to you about, which is all about these cyber attacks that we've experienced here, Chinese cyber intrusions. And you had a great piece in Foreign Affairs last week talking about, Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon and Flax Typhoon. So first of all, who comes up with these names? And do they actually mean anything? But really, like, what are the Chinese trying to accomplish here? And is this all state directed, or what's what's sort of the purpose of everything here?
Yeah, the names are terrible. Every company comes up with their own names, and so often it's hard to figure out who's referring to who. And we when we talked about Russia, we talked about the bears, right? There was Cozy Bear and others. So the typhoon refers to China and Asia. It's a Microsoft usage, but they're not helpful. But um, so if we think about Chinese cyber operations, essentially there's uh, espionage, right? So that would be the Salt Typhoon and the Flax Typhoon, which is collecting information. And China conducts both political military espionage and industrial espionage, so to steal secrets from the private sector. Um, Espionage is against a whole range of targets, right? So we know the Harris and the Trump campaigns, State Department, Treasury, Commerce, all of the kind of people who make decisions that will affect China's national interests. Um, but we also know they target journalists who are writing about issues that China is concerned about, right? So when Bloomberg was doing stories about the personal wealth of Chinese leaders, they went after Bloomberg and reporters and New York Times reporters. Uh, they go after activists in areas that China's interested in. So Tibet, Taiwan, Xinjiang, all those people are targets. And then there's a set of the cyber operations, attacks, penetrations that look to be preparing for possible military conflicts, right? So that is what Volt Typhoon was. So in those instances, Chinese operators were on critical infrastructure, what the term of art is prepositioning, right? So leaving some malware there in case there is a conflict in the Taiwan Straits, so they can cause social disturbances, take some systems down, slow U.S. decision making down, and in some ways act as a deterrent, right? Remind the United States leadership that any conflict we have is not going to remain in the Western Pacific. We can also reach out and touch you in some way.
So, and was this malware spread throughout our entire country in all different kinds of systems? Could it have affected our, water supply, our electricity? I mean, was it everywhere through everything or?
No, I mean, and so Salt Typhoon, which is the one I wrote about in Foreign Affairs, seems to have been telecoms, right? So it was taking advantage of some vulnerabilities they discovered in telecoms. Volt Typhoon has been found in some critical infrastructure around ports and cranes and things like that. And then some, the government has been fairly vague about what type of systems it's found it in, but um, we don't know how far and wide it's been.
So, that actually reminds me of that whole discussion. I mean, it could have been as much as a year ago, I guess, about cranes being, potentially at risk from Chinese intervention. And a lot of people kind of laughed that off. But what you're suggesting is that was absolutely the case. And perhaps the US government already knew about it, but hadn't released the information.
Yeah, it could have been, but it also, the U.S. government pushes back on Chinese technology for the vulnerability and disruption reason, and also for the data collections reasons. So I think the argument with the ports as well as, airport scanners and things is what type of data can be collected about, movement
Right.
through those areas and sent back to China.
Not about shutting it all down or
Not
something.
necessarily. Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Okay, so what about where we're at? I mean, obviously, the companies and, our government discovered these intrusions and called them out, called the Chinese, and we think this is all state directed, correct? This isn't just sort of independent actors, hacking, some one individual Chinese hacker sitting in a dark room, going after, US critical infrastructure.
Yeah, so it's definitely not an individual, it's groups, what and in some cases, it may be contractors, so, as you said, the US government, called out Chinese actors. They also sanctioned, some private companies that they say that supported, the operation. So we know that the Ministry of State Security, the MSS, contracts with some private companies to do some operations. So that's we're looking kind of at a growing ecosystem of private companies that support the state, and um, are told which targets to go after. But on industrial espionage, in some cases, they may freelance to raise their own money and things.
But I mean, sanctions, honestly, what are they going to accomplish actually, right? I mean, what does a sanction involve? Saying you can't do business with the United States?
Yeah.
Presumably, a number of these companies are doing a lot of business with the United States in any case. I mean, how effective is a sanction on a Chinese company that's, hacking, and aren't there just a million more of them?
Yeah. So I think sanctions we probably need to distinguish what level the sanctions are and who's targeted. So sanctions I totally agree at the firm level, and we've indicted individuals before, those are not effective, right? As you said, those companies don't do business with the United States, or they can just create a front company, which they do all the time. If you're an individual hacker, as long as you're not dumb, sometimes they are dumb, but as long as you're not dumb and travel to Thailand, or the Czech Republic, and then get arrested there, you're not ever going to see the inside of a U.S. Court. So that doesn't seem to do very much. It's you know it 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 doesn't deter it. It does serve some purpose in kind of letting other countries know what we think is bad action, so they can hopefully also do the same thing, and calls them out and warns other countries as well. There could be an argument, that maybe we should be sanctioning higher, right, at a higher level, um, about, could we figure out who's ordering the attacks or who's immediately benefiting? And, the example that we could look at is that, if we go back to the Obama administration, where we did sign this agreement with the Chinese about cyber-enabled espionage and the
And that was
theft of
economic espionage, right?
economic espionage.
Particular.
Um, Part of the way we probably brought the Chinese to the table was there were leaks that the US was considering sanctioning somebody very, very high up, um, about and who's benefiting from these leaks or from these hacks.
In an economic
Attention
context,
in an
right?
economic
They're
context.
benefiting financially from this.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. That, yeah, it does seem like an easier use case.
Yeah.
But what about like our own capabilities? Is there an argument to be made that, we should basically, do unto others as others do unto you, that we should demonstrate our own cyber offensive capabilities and perhaps that would be a greater deterrent?
So I think we have to distinguish between what types of operations, because political military operations, spying, the US does that, right? And so it's hard to call out China for that when we do it ourselves. So that's on us to defend ourselves better. There is possibly a way to disrupt Chinese operations. And the Biden administration's strategy from the Defense Department, from the Pentagon, talks about defending forward. So preventing attacks before they ever get to US networks, which means, disrupting them in third countries or possibly even disrupting them on Chinese networks. We don't know a
Just
lot
so,
about.
just so I'm clear, does that require knowing the source of the attack, the likely source of the attack? So we have
Yes.
some sense of who the bad actors are in China, and we just get into their systems
Yes.
basically and disrupt them before they.
Essentially, yes,
Okay.
exactly. So we're probably sitting on their systems and seeing what they're doing, and we choose to disrupt it before they can ever launch it.
Okay.
So the only public examples we have of this are are against Russia, not against China.
Okay.
So, like, we took down the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, which was doing, disinformation operations on, US platforms, social media platforms. We took down some of their infrastructure. Um, and in some cases, we actually knew the individual operators and sent them text messages saying, "We know you're doing this, stop it." So
I
in
wonder what
China,
they thought when they got those messages.
they probably thought it was pretty funny, but we there's no public reporting about what that would mean for China. So you would wanna disrupt it, right? Now, on prepositioning and critical infrastructure, there has been some argument that maybe we can come to some types of agreements with the Chinese, right? About what types of attacks are considered valid. And the Chinese did sign off. There's discussions in the UN. It's through a group called the Group of Government Experts. And they came up with a certain set of norms about how states should behave in cyberspace. And China signed that agreement. But the norm is not very constraining. The norm around critical infrastructure says non-interference on critical infrastructure during peacetime,
Okay.
right? So interference is a pretty high bar. So the Chinese might be able to argue that, well, yeah, we were on it, but we didn't interfere with it. And in fact, you can see when US government officials call China out for Salt Typhoon, sorry, for Volt Typhoon, they say it's escalatory and dangerous. They don't say it broke any norms.
Got it. Okay.
So,
So it's a little bit
um,
like gray zone activity in the digital space.
exactly.
Interesting.
And so again, there may be there have been attempts before to try to talk to the Chinese about, can we talk about some types of critical infrastructure that should be off limits, but there's no doubt that the US does the same thing, and lets the Chinese know in some way.
Okay. The Chinese just don't publicize it the way that we do. Okay.
Yes.
So you mentioned Russia, and I'm really interested. We've heard, Russia is a bad actor in this space, Iran, North Korea. You know, are they all the same in terms of how they approach this? Are they different? Do they work together? Do you think they're learning from each other?
Yeah. So there's a great quote from Rob Joyce, who used to be at the NSA. And he used to say that Russia is like a hurricane and China is climate change, right? So we see a lot, especially around Ukraine. We see lots of disruptive attacks from Russia. We've seen Russia use it in a military conflict, which we've never, which we haven't seen before. We see lots of Russian-based ransomware gangs, right? That do attacks against um, U.S. hospitals and schools and things. But those are criminal gangs that the Russians turn a blind eye to. And China is kind of more uh, disciplined and also has a longer game, right? Because China has global technologies and Russia no longer has any global technology game. Um, Iranians, less sophisticated, but also more willing to take risks. Um, North Koreans have still continue doing espionage and trying to collect information, but have really focused on theft of cryptocurrencies to fund the regime and to fund the missile programs. So the North Koreans are really focused on raising money. Now, there doesn't seem to be there's definitely interaction, but they don't do operations together, right? In the sense of we have to remember that these are usually the spy agencies that conduct these operations, and spy agencies don't trust each other. And also, it's good to remember that even after China and Russia signed what was many people said was a no hacking agreement, that neither side would hack each other. Weeks later, both sides reported that the other side was hacking each other.
That's
So,
hilarious.
so that there's probably not a lot of cooperation on that level. They do seem to be learning from each other around disinformation and online operations. So what the Chinese do on Facebook and um, uh, X and other things looks more like what the Russians do than it used to, right? Before, the Chinese were mostly about trumpeting, CCP success and what Xi Jinping did. And now they're much more willing to press on socially divisive issues and try to, get Americans to yell at each other like the Russians do.
Right. We saw some of that on January 6th, I think, right? Both the
Exactly.
Russians and the Chinese were in the mix during that time.
Yeah. And there's definitely technological cooperation. So, Huawei in particular has done a lot of work in Russia. The Russians learned and brought a lot of technologies to help control the internet. So that also has some defensive and security perspective. North Korean actors sometimes operate from inside of China. Um, there was probably some training in the early days, but probably not anymore. So there's probably a little bit on the margins, but not all that important to anybody's practices.
Okay, so it's not a collective effort on the part of these sort of four disruptive actors and, coordinated and
Not on cyber
how are
attacks.
we going to go after the United States and its
No. I mean,
partners?
just to use a other example from just this area about not wanting to share, like it took the US a long time to tell NATO to give NATO some sense of its capabilities in this space. They were so tightly held that NATO used to complain all the time, like, we have no idea what you're capable of and what you're doing. We probably shared more closely with GCHQ and the Brits, but it's because it's so tightly controlled intelligence, countries don't like to share.
Right. And besides, some of it we probably are using to learn about even what our allies and partners are doing sometimes. Okay,
Exactly.
so let's tie this up and talk a little bit about the strategy that you wrote the for sort of State Department for the Biden administration that does deal with our allies and partners and how we should work together because presumably we are not the only ones facing these kinds of attacks from China. Others are as well. So what is your strategy? What is it that you are seeking to accomplish with the strategy? Did you bring allies and partners in even as you were drafting it?
Yeah.
A little bit about what this was all about.
Yeah, so the policy was broader than just the cyber things we were talking about. It was, both cyber, and digital. Um, we had this big framing idea of digital solidarity, which is the idea that, the US cannot go it alone. We're made better off, cooperating with our allies very closely on a whole range of issues. And in fact, we're made better off when their economies are innovative. All right. So it's not great if the top 10 AI companies are all American and nobody has anything else. Right. We want the French, we want the Brits, we want the Australians to also have really robust AI systems. So that was kind of the big overall framing of it. Um, as you mentioned, alliances and partnerships were a huge part of the strategy. When I was writing the strategy, I socialized early versions of it with once in Singapore, so with kind of East Asian, Southeast Asian friends and partners, and then once in Europe to get kind of their input and feedback on it. And for the most part, not surprisingly, they were pretty receptive to it. The digital solidarity framing was in contrast to digital sovereignty, right, and cyber sovereignty, which are the views that the Russians and Chinese promote about, you have to localize data, you have to control the internet. And so we were arguing against that, we're all made better off by trusted flows between our partners. And then, of course, we were affirming the rights respecting democratic usage of these technologies, as opposed to strengthening surveillance and repression of minority groups.
And so once the strategy was written, just so that everybody listening can understand, what then happens with that? Is that then, do other countries sign on to it, or it's not a treaty or an agreement, but
Yeah.
how do you move forward with something like this?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, right, if you think of any strategy, it has three audiences. As you said, international, so other countries can know what we're gonna do, and we tried to highlight what our priorities were, and then after I left, there was an implementation strategy that was kind of put place that signaled some of the things that were most important to Ambassador Fick and the Bureau. And there were, publicly they discussed two or three things, had to do about AI governance, had to do about trusted infrastructure and some developing partners. There's the internal audience, right? So just the US government, because there hadn't been a US government wide cyber strategy for over 12 years. And so this was just an attempt to get everybody kind of agree to what do we think we're accomplishing and make sure we're all kind of going in the same direction. So, the DoD had a cyber strategy. After I left, USAID released one. Um, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, didn't have a strategy, but they had a framework. It was international. So this was an attempt to try to get everybody on the same page about it. And then finally, kind of the domestic audiences, so people will know what it is the U.S. is trying to accomplish. So really, after the strategy came out, the hope was, oh yeah, we're all going to push on these broad ideas. And as I said, there were some kind of three or four priorities for the last. The strategy came out in June of 2024, so there was really only 6 months to kind of to push it forward. But as I said, it was, there was a lot of push on AI governance. There had been some great work that had happened around counter ransomware and helping our partners in Costa Rica in particular respond to that. And could we build on that and help other countries? And then a lot of work around trusted infrastructure.
Yeah. And hopefully some of that, at least on the trusted infrastructure and maybe even the counter ransomware type of work, can continue in the Trump administration, even if on the AI governance there may be some differences of opinion and outlook. Um,
Yeah, I think there's, I don't look, they're not going to keep digital solidarity and the AI governance stuff. Definitely, they're not going to keep. But yes, I think kind of run rights aware initiative, they definitely should keep. Like, in fact, it's also a success story because other countries have kind of taken the lead. So there's like 4 different verticals about, law enforcement, international, and other countries have taken the lead there. So it's become an increasingly kind of uh, lighter lift for NSC and then state to direct it. And so, we definitely should continue participating and supporting. Uh, I think the language around trusted infrastructure, and in particular, maybe we'll have to wait to see after the 90-day review of all financial aid. But the the last year I was there, and the last year of the bureau, they received $50 million from Congress for a cyber and digital and related technologies fund. So that was being used to support countries that were attacked. It was being used for to make arguments about why you shouldn't use Chinese infrastructure and things like that. And sorry, my sense is that Secretary Rubio is totally on board with that and will want to use that.
Yeah, and I mean, even if you think back to the first Trump administration, I mean, they really did start the work on the, clean networks, trusted networks, which was, I think, continued and built up by the Biden administration. But at least in the first Trump administration, I think there was, definitely an effort to get out, especially through, our allies and partners, but other emerging middle income economies and talk to them and try to persuade them, not to use Chinese technology in their infrastructure. So hopefully that element will, continue. Okay, so always finish up with 5 quick questions. So here we go. What is your must-read book or article on China?
So the article is so very cyber focused, but it's called From Vegas to Chengdu. And it's all about kind of hacking contests and how China is very much tapping into the energy of what used to be kind of information security researchers, private hackers, and funneling that into China's offensive capabilities. It comes out of Zurich, the Center for Security Studies. The author is Eugenio Benicasa. It's a really great study of at a very kind of low, in the weeds level, but lots of insight.
Sounds really interesting and also somewhat terrifying. Okay. All right. What you spent, your time in Washington at the State Department. What do you miss most and least about your time there?
So I mean, it was a very exciting time to be in state. The Cyber and Digital Bureau was a year old when I joined, so there was just a huge amount of energy and excitement about what we were doing. You could tell, other people in the building wanted to be at the bureau and work in the bureau. Ambassador Fick, was a new leader and had a great energy about it. And I know we're at a time where, there's all this questioning about the competency of federal government officials, but the people I work with were, some of them were political appointees, some of them were short term, some of them had been in the bureau for 15, 20 years, but, working on undersea cables for 15 years, and just were so incredibly knowledgeable, and dedicated to the mission. And so I missed the colleagues and the people working with that.
And what don't you miss?
Yeah, I don't miss the bureaucracy. um, so both on the kind of I went to DC once a month because I was still living in New York. Just trying to travel is just like for an organization that does foreign policy and travels everywhere is just it's just mind-numbingly complicated and just blows your mind. And I had to produce a document for the interagency, so dealing with 18 other agencies, and then inside the agencies, 15 or 20 other people giving me their comments. And, at some point, I just couldn't even remember why we were arguing about a word that no longer had any meaningful difference. But I don't miss that.
I can relate to that. Anything you wish, that the U.S. had done differently with regard to China when you were in office? So basically looking at Biden administration policy and thinking, I wish we would have done this. And for whatever
Yeah.
reason, we just didn't get that done.
So I think it's a critique of the strategy as well, and it started to happen at the end, but I think it's actually, engagement with China on these issues, right? After certainly after the spy balloon, but even before then, there was a lot of kind of questioning about, well, what do we gain from talking with the Chinese about these things? And cyber conversations have never gone well, and there are definitely reasons why we want to think about what we're getting out of it, but we definitely stepped back for the majority of my time there, and certainly for the Biden administration, of saying, we're not going to directly engage with the Chinese on cyber things. We're going to do it other ways. And I think if we were to do it again, we probably should have started earlier.
Started earlier with the strategy.
Certainly should have started earlier with the strategy, but should have also, because
Like
after I
earlier with
left,
sort of communicating with China, having
communicating.
a
After I left,
tobacco discussion.
yeah. So that, there was that discussion on AI governance with the Chinese that happened, and there were, Ambassador Blinken brought up cyber in one of his last meetings, and Ambassador Fick accompanied Secretary Blinken on that trip. But and there were discussions that were supposed to go forward. So that would have probably been better to do earlier.
Right. Yes, I think the Biden administration spent, close to 3 years on the competition side and really only on the last year or so began to do the managing of the competition, element
Yeah.
of it. What China issue do you think we don't know enough about? Maybe it's your own.
Yeah. I mean, so I was thinking kind of in my own field, but I think it's true, across the board, which is, we just have such bad understanding of how the information flows and how different parts of the organization, different parts of the Chinese government speak to each other and understand what the other side is doing. And so, when I read the documents from the Chinese Foreign Ministry about what they're trying to accomplish in cyber, I don't have any idea about, did the PLA have any input into this? Did they talk to the PLA? And so I know with the international strategy, I know the DoD had an input. I went to the DoD 3 times to talk to them, and they commented on the document, and just, and that would help, understand what which Chinese positions we should take more seriously and which ones, are kind of priority. But I think that's a problem across the field for all of us, is, between limited access, centralization of control, and all the other things, just don't have much insight into that.
Okay, last one. On a scale of 1 to 10, how likely do you think we are to see a breakthrough in U.S. China relations in the next, let's just say in the course of the Trump administration?
And so one being very likely, or
10 being very likely, 1
10
being
being very likely. And a breakthrough means like,
I would say breakthrough.
yeah,
Let's assume for the sake of argument, we don't mean a breakthrough in terms of a war on
yeah,
Taiwan. We mean a breakthrough in terms of a positive stabilization, improvement, in the relationship that benefits U.S. interests.
yeah. I'm gonna say pretty low. I'm gonna say three,
Great.
three or
I
four.
think you've come in the highest of anybody I've
Oh,
had
right. Oh,
so
really?
far. So,
Oh,
okay,
I was
okay. Well,
trying to be the less pessimistic, least pessimistic.
okay. So on that note of subdued optimism, let me thank you, Adam, for a great conversation on a often very complex, complicated topic. I think you all helped to all of us to understand it better. I know the U.S. government is poor for not having you in it, but the outside world is richer. And thank you for sharing your insights with us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So, if you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more reasoned discourse and debate on China, I encourage you to subscribe to China Considered via the Hoover Institution YouTube channel or podcast platform of your choice. In our next program, we'll be talking about what the Chinese economy is looking like on the ground with Leland Miller, founder and CEO of China and Beige Book.